The 12-month period ending March 2026 was the hottest on record in the continental United States, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The hottest March in at least 132 years of measurement. A heat wave swept across the American West so extreme that the World Weather Attribution Team, which is the international scientific body that determines whether specific weather events were caused or intensified by climate change, called the event virtually impossible without human-caused warming. And that was March, not July, not August, March. Over 56% of the contiguous United States is currently in at least moderate drought, the largest drought coverage in more than 3 years, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. The western mountain snowpack is sitting at 25 to 50% of normal, which means the meltwater that is supposed to feed rivers, fill reservoirs, irrigate farmland, and cool power plants through the summer months will arrive at roughly half the volume it should. And NOAA's Climate Prediction Center has 36 states leaning toward above normal temperatures this summer. 36 states, only Wisconsin and Michigan don't have at least some portion flagged for extra heat. And the electric grid that is supposed to keep 330 million Americans cool during the hottest summer conditions in recorded history is facing what the North American Electric Reliability Corporation described as explosive demand growth that has caused its 10-year summer peak demand forecast to grow by more than 50% within a single year. John Mora, NERC's Director of Reliability Assessments, said in plain language that he has been doing this for close to 30 years, and this is probably one of the grimmest pictures they have painted in a while. And then he said the sentence that should be on the front page of every newspaper in America. Simply put, our infrastructure is not being built fast enough to keep up with the rising demand. The power grid cannot keep up, the water supply is at half capacity, the heat is at record levels, and the Iran war has created what the International Energy Agency called the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Every one of those facts is documented. Every one is current. And when you stack them on top of each other, the picture that emerges for the summer of 2026 is unlike anything Americans alive today have experienced. The power grid is being crushed between data centers and air conditioners, and there is not enough electricity for both. 2 days ago, the Daily Upside published an investigation that documented the collision course between two forces that are simultaneously demanding enormous quantities of electricity from the same grid at the same time. The first force is data centers. The artificial intelligence boom that began with ChatGPT in late 2022 kicked off what the Daily Upside described as the largest capital expenditure project this side of the 19th century railroad expansion. Tech giants have planted massive data centers across the country to train and run AI models, and those data centers require staggering quantities of electricity that run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, with no seasonal variation. The second force is air conditioning. During summer heat waves, demand for cooling climbs hour by hour as temperatures rise, pushing the grid toward its absolute physical limits. And Dr. Mark McNees, Director of Social and Sustainable Enterprises at Florida State University, told the Daily Upside something that should alarm every household in America. He said the grid cannot support both data center growth and summer peak demand at current capacity. The math does not work without massive new buildout, and the question is who pays? The math does not work. A university director used those exact words, and the build-out he is describing, the new power plants, the new transmission lines, the new substations that would be needed to handle both loads simultaneously, is years behind the demand curve. Consider Texas. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, the grid operator that serves most of the state, said in a report published earlier this month that peak demand could reach 367,790 megawatts by 2032. The current record peak demand, set during a blistering heat wave in the summer of 2023 that nearly stressed the grid to exhaustion, was 85,500 megawatts. The projected demand is more than 4 times the current record. And between now and 2032, no one has explained where the additional 282,000 megawatts of generation capacity will come from. Because it does not exist. It has not been built. The permits have not been filed, the land has not been acquired, the turbines have not been manufactured. And the summer of 2026 arrives in approximately 45 days with a grid that is already at its limits before a single data center server has been turned off for the season, or a single air conditioner has been unplugged. In September 2022, as triple-digit temperatures baked large parts of California for days at a time, state officials begged residents to dial down their air conditioning use or risk breaking the electrical grid. The plea worked. Demand fell during peak hours and California avoided potentially catastrophic rolling blackouts. That was 3.5 years ago. Since then, AI fever gripped Silicon Valley and the world, kicking off the largest data center build-out in history. The data centers that did not exist in September 2022 are now consuming enormous quantities of electricity in the same states where residents were begged to turn off their air conditioning. And unlike air conditioning, which peaks for a few hours on the hottest afternoons and then drops off in the evening, data centers run at full load around the clock. They provide the baseload demand that the grid was not designed to carry alongside summer peak cooling demand. The Daily Upside quoted an energy expert who put the problem in terms that no utility planner can solve on the timeline that matters. He said summer peak loads in the Sunbelt plus always-on data center baseload is a combination utility resource plans were not designed for, and the infrastructure to fix it is years behind the demand curve. Years behind, not months. Years. The summer of 2026 arrives in 45 days. The infrastructure that would solve the problem will not arrive for years. And between now and then, the grid will be asked to do something it physically cannot do without either shedding load, which means blackouts, or operating at the very edge of its capacity, which means a single unexpected failure at a single power plant or a single transmission line could cascade into a regional outage affecting millions of people. The question that every American household should be asking right now is not whether the grid will be stressed this summer. NERC has already answered that question. The grid will be stressed. The question is whether the stress will remain manageable or whether it will cross the threshold into failure. And the answer depends on variables that nobody can control: the temperature, the wind, the humidity, and whether the aging infrastructure that has been running near its limits for years finally gives way under the combined pressure of heat, demand, and neglect. NERC's most recent long-term reliability assessment was even more specific about where the failures will occur and when. MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator that covers the power grid from Illinois to Minnesota, faces a high risk of energy shortfalls beginning this year, with shortfalls in some areas possible during normal peak conditions. Not extreme conditions, normal peak conditions. The grid in the central United States may not be able to handle a normal hot day in July without shedding load, which is the industry euphemism for cutting power to entire neighborhoods to prevent the grid from collapsing. PJM Interconnection, which serves the Mid-Atlantic and parts of the Midwest including New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Virginia, faces elevated risks beginning in 2026, specifically because resource additions are not keeping up with generator retirements and demand growth. The Southwest Power Pool and New England face elevated risk under extreme conditions. And ERCOT in Texas faces what NERC described as surging load growth driving resource adequacy concerns as the share of dispatchable resources in the mix struggles to keep pace. Every major grid region in the United States has a warning flag attached to it. Not one, not two, every single one. And NERC's director used the word explosive to describe the demand growth. That is a reliability assessment director using a word associated with detonation to describe the trajectory of electricity demand in the country he is supposed to keep lit. The coal plants that provided the baseload power for decades are being retired. The natural gas plants that were supposed to replace them are being built too slowly. The solar and wind installations that are scaling rapidly cannot provide dispatchable power on demand because the sun does not shine at night and the wind does not blow on command. And the battery storage technology that is supposed to bridge those gaps is still in its infancy at grid scale. The system is being asked to do more with less at the exact moment when doing less would mean people dying in their homes during a heat wave. 40 million people depend on a river that is running at half capacity, and the snowpack that feeds it has melted too early. Newsweek reported that a water shortage warning has been issued for the 40 million people who rely on the Colorado River. The river basin enters spring 2026 in one of its most precarious positions on record. Snowpack across the basin is hovering at roughly 50% of normal or lower. The warm, dry winter that preceded it ranks among the hottest ever observed in several western states. And AccuWeather meteorologist Kai Kirkau warned that the heat wave that swept across the southwest in March would cause much of the remaining snow to melt early, bringing the threat of water shortages this summer and worsening the ongoing drought. Denver Water, which depends on mountain snow for 90% of its supply, reported snowpack levels between 55 and 71% of normal across its collection areas and cautioned that additional drought response measures are likely this year. Lake Powell, one of the Colorado River's two major reservoirs, expects to receive just 52% of its usual inflow from snowmelt and is edging closer to what is called minimum power pool, the point at which its hydropower production could cease entirely. If Lake Powell drops below minimum power pool, the Glen Canyon Dam stops generating electricity. That is not a metaphor. The dam physically stops producing power because the water level is too low to turn the turbines. And that electricity does not disappear into an abstraction. It is removed from the grid that serves millions of homes across the Southwest at the exact time when those homes need the most power to stay cool during the hottest months of the year. Every major river basin in the West is experiencing a snow drought according to NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System. Between the beginning of January and the end of March 2026, the percentage of the U.S. landscape facing the worst drought conditions increased from 2% to 15%. The Drought Severity and Coverage Index at the end of March hit its most severe first-quarter level since at least the year 2000. E&E News by Politico documented that conditions in 2026 raise fears of summer water shortages, crop failures, and major blazes. The mechanism is straightforward and relentless. When soil is dry, incoming solar energy heats the ground and air directly instead of being used to evaporate moisture. Dry soil is one of the strongest predictors of extreme heat events because there is no evaporative cooling to moderate temperatures. The West is entering summer with dry soil, depleted snowpack, falling reservoir levels, and above normal temperature forecasts. The ingredients for a catastrophic summer water crisis are assembled, they are sitting on the counter, and the oven is preheating. And the Colorado River crisis is not an isolated Western problem. The river supplies drinking water to nearly 40 million people across 7 states and Mexico. It irrigates farmland that produces approximately 15% of the nation's crops and 13% of its livestock. The cities of Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Los Angeles, San Diego, Denver, Salt Lake City, and Albuquerque all depend on Colorado River water to varying degrees. When the river runs low, the water allocations that have been negotiated between states for a century come under pressure. Senior water rights holders, primarily agricultural users who receive their allocations first, have priority over cities and suburbs that developed later. In a severe shortage, the cities that grew fastest in the past 30 years, the suburbs of Phoenix, the sprawl of Las Vegas, the developments of southern Utah, could face mandatory water restrictions that go far beyond voluntary conservation requests. Mandatory restrictions mean limits on outdoor watering, limits on pool filling, limits on car washing, and in extreme scenarios, limits on indoor water use during peak hours. The infrastructure that delivers Colorado River water to these cities, the canals, the aqueducts, the treatment plants, was designed for a river that delivered a certain volume reliably every year. That reliability has collapsed. The river has been in a drought that began in 2000 and has intensified with each passing decade. Lake Mead, the nation's largest reservoir, dropped to a record low of 1,040 feet in 2020 and has not recovered to pre-drought levels despite temporary wet years. Water managers are now planning for a future where the Colorado River delivers 20 to 30% less water on a sustained basis than the 20th century average. And the summer of 2026, with snowpack at 50% of normal and record heat accelerating evaporation from reservoirs, may be the summer that forces the first mandatory urban water rationing in a major American city since the drought emergencies of the 1970s. Most Americans under the age of 50 have never been told they cannot use as much water as they want. That experience is coming. And it is coming to cities that were built on the assumption that water would always be abundant. The Iran war energy crisis is colliding with summer electricity demand, and natural gas prices are going to devastate your utility bill. Approximately 40% of the American power grid runs on natural gas. Before the Iran war, natural gas prices were elevated but manageable. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz disrupted global LNG exports from Qatar, one of the world's largest liquefied natural gas producers, which immediately tightened the global natural gas market. The United States is now one of the world's largest LNG exporters, and the Daily Upside reported that when the U.S. is exporting liquid natural gas, it removes that product from domestic markets, resulting in a higher base cost for utilities to sell power to local residents. The Iran war has simultaneously increased global demand for American LNG exports, as European and Asian buyers scramble for alternatives to Gulf supplies, while domestic demand for natural gas-generated electricity is climbing into summer peak season. The American consumer is competing with European and Asian utilities for the same natural gas molecules, and the price is set by the global market, not by the domestic one. Bloomberg documented earlier this year that natural gas prices have been rising more than twice as much as wages, and that electricity bills have run well ahead of overall inflation, especially as power-hungry data centers come online. The Urban Institute's American Affordability Tracker found that residential electricity costs have increased faster than earnings across much of the country, leaving customers paying about $40 more per month in December 2025 than they paid in December 2017. And that $40 increase was before the Iran war, before the Hormuz closure, before the global LNG supply disruption, and before the summer heat peak that will push air conditioning demand to its annual maximum. The electricity bill that arrives in July and August 2026 will reflect all of those pressures simultaneously. The war premium on natural gas, the data center demand on generation capacity, the heat wave demand on the distribution grid, the drought reduction in hydropower, and the retirement of coal and gas plants that has reduced the total available generation while demand has been growing explosively. Every one of those forces pushes the same direction: higher bills, less reliable supply, greater risk of rolling blackouts, and more Americans who simply cannot afford to run their air conditioning during the days when air conditioning is the difference between discomfort and death. The arithmetic of a summer utility bill in 2026 is punishing for any household and potentially lethal for fixed-income households. The average residential electricity bill in the United States has already risen from approximately $121 per month in 2020 to over $156 per month by late 2025, a 30% increase. In southern states where air conditioning is not optional from June through September, summer electricity bills routinely exceed $250 to $350 per month during peak cooling periods. And every additional pressure, the war premium on natural gas, the data center demand on generation, the drought reduction in hydropower, the retirement of baseload plants, pushes that number higher. An elderly couple on Social Security, whose monthly benefit is $2,400 and whose summer electricity bill reaches $350, is devoting 15% of their gross income to a single utility. And if that bill rises another 20 to 30% from the war-driven natural gas spike that has not yet fully materialized in utility rates, the bill reaches $420 to $455 per month. That is approaching 20% of their income, for electricity alone. And the response that many low-income households adopt when the bill exceeds what they can pay is to ration their own cooling. They set the thermostat to 82, then 84, then 86. They run the air conditioning only at night. They endure afternoon temperatures that push indoor heat to levels that medical professionals classify as dangerous for anyone over 65. And they do not call for help because they do not consider themselves to be in crisis. They consider themselves to be managing their budget. The crisis arrives quietly, with no emergency call, no ambulance, no hospital visit. It arrives as heat exhaustion that becomes heat stroke, that becomes organ failure in a kitchen that reached 105 degrees because the person who lived there could not afford to turn the air conditioning below 86. 12,000 people die from heat in America every year, and a blackout during a heat wave would kill thousands more in a single city. Research published in the journal Environmental Science and Technology estimates that heat exposure contributes to approximately 12,000 deaths per year in the United States. That makes heat the deadliest form of extreme weather in America, killing more people annually than hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and lightning combined. And those 12,000 deaths occur during summers when the power grid is functioning and air conditioning is available. A 2023 study published in peer-reviewed research modeled what would happen if a multi-day blackout coincided with a heat wave in Phoenix, Arizona. The researchers concluded that nearly half the population of Phoenix would require emergency department care for heat stroke or other heat-related illnesses. And they estimated that 12,800 people in Phoenix alone would die in a single city during a single event. The Federation of American Scientists published a detailed analysis warning that grids are facing unprecedented strain due to record-high temperatures, which simultaneously reduce transmission efficiency and spike demand. The Pacific Northwest heat wave of 2021 resulted in thousands of heat-related emergency department visits and over 700 deaths. The Texas winter storm of 2021 left 4.5 million customers without power and caused over 240 deaths and $130 billion in economic damages. Major electrical grid failure events in the United States, those lasting at least 1 hour and impacting 50,000 or more customers, increased by more than 60% over the most recent 5-year reporting period. And 46% of those blackout events occurred between May and September, when heat risk is the highest. The trend lines are converging. Heat events are becoming more frequent and more intense. Blackout events are becoming more frequent. The grid is under more strain. And the population most vulnerable to the combination: older Americans, Americans with chronic health conditions, Americans who cannot afford to run their air conditioning, Americans who live in housing without adequate insulation, is growing. A researcher quoted by CBS said something that captured the entire crisis in a single observation. He said, "In a city like Phoenix, air conditioning is life support for people, And if you have a disruption, that's a tremendous vulnerability. Air conditioning is life support, not comfort, not convenience, life support. And the system that provides that life support is being asked to carry more load than it was designed for, with less margin than it has ever had, during what is forecast to be one of the hottest summers in recorded history, while simultaneously competing with data centers for the same electrons, while natural gas prices are elevated by a war, while hydropower is reduced by drought, and while coal plants continue to retire without adequate replacement. The question is not whether there will be blackouts this summer. NERC has already told us that 2/3 of North America is at risk. The question is whether the blackouts will be short enough and localized enough to avoid mass casualties. And the answer to that question depends entirely on the weather. If July brings a sustained, multi-day, multi-region heat dome of the kind that has become increasingly common, the power grid in multiple states could fail simultaneously. And if it fails during a period when temperatures exceed 110 degrees in Phoenix, 105 degrees in Las Vegas, 100 degrees in Dallas, and 95 degrees in Chicago, the death toll will not be measured in dozens. It will be measured in thousands. And no government agency at any level has a plan for mass casualties from a compound heat wave and blackout event, because, as the Federation of American Scientists documented, few states have conducted exercises that simulate the loss of electricity, water, and sanitation systems under extreme heat conditions. The people most likely to die during a compound heat and blackout event are the people who are least visible to emergency management systems. They are elderly Americans living alone in apartments without adequate insulation. They are homebound Americans with chronic conditions whose medications require refrigeration. They are low-income Americans who have been disconnecting their air conditioning to save money on electric bills that have risen 30% in the past 3 years. They are homeless Americans who have no shelter from temperatures that can exceed 115 degrees on urban pavement. They are Americans in manufactured housing and mobile homes that are poorly insulated and heat to interior temperatures of 130 degrees within hours of a power failure in a heat wave. And the emergency response system that is supposed to protect them during these events is itself dependent on electricity. Hospitals run on backup generators that have limited fuel. 911 call centers require power to operate. Water treatment plants need electricity to pump and purify water. Traffic signals go dark, which jams evacuation routes. Cell towers have battery backups that last approximately 8 to 12 hours before they go silent, cutting off communication for everyone in the affected area. When the grid fails during a heat wave, it does not just remove air conditioning from homes. It removes the entire infrastructure of emergency response, communication, water purification, medical care, and transportation that a functioning society depends on. The blackout does not just make it hot. It makes it impossible to call for help, impossible to get water, impossible to reach a hospital, and impossible to communicate with the people who might be able to save you. That is what America will go dark means. Not figuratively. Literally, the lights, the phones, the water, the hospitals, the traffic, the communication, all of it, dark. Wildfires have already burned more than doubled the average and the fire season has not even started. E&D News by Politico reported that wildfires burned more than 1.6 million acres in the first quarter of 2026, more than double the average for January through March over the past decade. The fire season has not started. The traditional wildfire season runs from June through October in the West. And the fires that have already occurred in March and early April are burning in conditions that would typically be too cool and too wet for major fire activity. The fact that they are burning now in spring tells you what the vegetation and soil conditions are like heading into summer. Dry, historically dry. Research published in environmental research letters found that in years with earlier snowmelt in the West, wildfires generally burned more acres. The snowmelt in the spring of 2026 was among the earliest on record. NOAA's spring weather outlook projects that drought conditions are likely to persist across the West through summer, citing low snowpack, below-average precipitation, and above-average temperatures expected through June. New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Northern California face above-average wildfire risks in May and June. The Pacific Northwest, Colorado, and Utah face elevated risks in July. Every wildfire season now competes with the grid for resources. When a major wildfire burns through transmission line corridors, it takes power lines offline. When utilities preemptively shut off power to prevent their equipment from igniting fires, known as public safety power shutoffs in California, hundreds of thousands of customers lose electricity during the exact conditions when they need it most. When smoke from distant fires blankets urban areas, it reduces solar panel output by 10 to 30%, cutting into the renewable generation that was supposed to help meet peak summer demand. And when fire suppression requires massive water drops from helicopters and tanker planes, it diverts resources from communities that are already underwater shortage warnings. The wildfire crisis, and the water crisis, and the power crisis, and the heat crisis are not separate events. They are the same event viewed from different angles. Dry conditions drive all four simultaneously. Low snowpack means less water, means less hydropower, means more strain on gas and coal plants, means higher electricity costs, means more people unable to afford cooling, means more heat-related illness and death. It is a single system, and the system is failing at every node. The wildfire crisis has a dimension that most Americans have never considered because it has never been explained to them in plain language. When a major wildfire burns in a forested area near transmission lines, the utility that operates those lines faces two terrible options. The first option is to keep the power flowing and risk the fire reaching the lines, which can cause the lines to arc, throw sparks, and start additional fires downwind. Pacific Gas and Electric's equipment was determined to have caused the Camp Fire in Paradise, California in 2018, which killed 85 people, destroyed 14,000 homes, and resulted in criminal convictions and $25.5 billion in settlements. The second option is to preemptively shut off the power, which protects the utility from liability, but removes electricity from hundreds of thousands of households during the exact conditions, extreme heat and dry air, when those households need air conditioning to survive. California utilities now conduct public safety power shutoffs, or PSPS events, routinely during fire season. In some years, millions of Californians have experienced multi-day power shutoffs during red flag warning conditions when temperatures are highest and fire risk is greatest. The shutoffs are planned, they are announced in advance, they are supposed to be targeted, and they are devastating for elderly residents, for medically vulnerable residents, for residents who depend on electric pumps for well water, and for businesses that cannot operate without power. And the wildfire smoke itself is a cascading health crisis. When fires burn in the west, smoke plumes travel hundreds or thousands of miles downwind, blanketing cities as far away as New York and Philadelphia, with air quality that exceeds hazardous levels. In 2023, wildfire smoke from Canada turned the skies over New York City orange and gave the city the worst air quality of any major city on Earth for a day. Smoke exposure causes respiratory inflammation, exacerbates asthma and COPD, increases cardiovascular risk, and is linked to premature death in elderly and chronically ill populations. And the smoke reduces solar panel output across every community it covers, cutting into renewable electricity generation during the weeks when solar power is most needed to meet peak demand. The fires that burn in July reduce the electricity that is available in August. The smoke that spreads in August reduces the solar generation that was supposed to offset the coal and gas retirements. Every system is linked, and every link is under strain. Summer food prices will reflect the worst combination of energy costs, drought, and supply chain disruption in a generation. The summer food price outlook is being shaped by three simultaneous pressures that have never converged at this scale before. The first pressure is energy. The Iran war drove gasoline up 21.2% in March and fuel oil up more than 30%. Every calorie of food in America is transported by diesel, processed with electricity generated partially from natural gas and refrigerated throughout the supply chain. The energy cost increase from the war has not yet fully arrived in food prices because the supply chain operates on a 60 to 120-day lag. The food you buy in June and July will reflect the energy prices of March and April. The second pressure is drought. The agricultural outlook for the West is dire. Specialty crop producers in the southern Appalachians face what the NOAA forecast describes as the most challenging agricultural weather scenario in the current outlook, with very high probability of above-average temperatures combined with no expected improvement in drought conditions. The Colorado River Basin that irrigates vast agricultural regions is running at half capacity. Ranchers in western Colorado are walking across bone-dry stock ponds, and the avian influenza outbreak that has now resulted in the culling of over 185 million birds continues to suppress egg and poultry supply, keeping those prices at elevated levels that have not returned to pre-outbreak baselines despite nearly 4 years of ongoing management. The third pressure is the supply chain disruption from the Strait of Hormuz closure. Global shipping has been dislocated. Maritime insurance costs have spiked. Container shipping companies including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd suspended straight transits, forcing rerouting that adds days and costs to every shipment. And agricultural imports that transit through the Gulf, including fertilizer components, specialized seeds, and agricultural chemicals, have been delayed or repriced at war premiums. The combination of these three pressures on a food system that was already 36% more expensive than it was in 2014 will produce summer grocery bills that break new records every month from June through September. Pro-Farmers analysis confirmed that the Western drought and heat forecast is concerning for irrigated agriculture, where summer water availability is already constrained, and that specialty crop producers face a double pressure of heat and moisture stress. The farmers who grow the fresh produce that fills the summer produce aisle, the tomatoes, the peppers, the lettuce, the berries, the stone fruits, are facing input costs that are the highest in their careers, water availability that is the lowest in their experience, and temperatures that are the most extreme in the historical record. Something has to give, and what gives is either the price, which rises, or the supply, which shrinks, or both. The American grocery store in August 2026 will look different than it looked in August 2025. The prices will be higher, the selection will be thinner, the fresh produce section will be smaller, and the household budget that was supposed to cover groceries through the summer will be exhausted before Labor Day. And behind all of these individual crises, the power grid strain, the water shortage, the wildfire risk, the food price explosion, the energy cost surge, the heat mortality risk, there is a single structural reality that nobody in any official capacity is willing to state clearly, because stating it clearly would require admitting that the problem has no short-term solution. The American infrastructure that was built for a 20th century climate, a 20th century population distribution, and a 20th century energy demand profile is being asked to operate in 21st century conditions that exceed its design parameters in every direction. The power grid was designed for a world where summer peak demand was predictable and manageable with fossil fuel baseload plants. It is now operating in a world where demand is growing explosively, where the baseload plants are being retired, where data centers are consuming electricity at a rate nobody anticipated 5 years ago, and where heat waves are more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting than the grid was engineered to withstand. The water system was designed for a world where snowpack reliably accumulated in winter and melted slowly in spring, feeding rivers and reservoirs through the summer. It is now operating in a world where snowpack is at 50% of normal, where the melt happens weeks earlier than the system expects, and where the population that depends on the water has grown by tens of millions since the infrastructure was sized. The food system was designed for a world where energy was cheap, water was abundant, labor was available, and the climate was within historical ranges. It is now operating in a world where energy is war-priced, water is drought-restricted, labor has been deported, and the climate is setting records that scientists describe as virtually impossible without human-caused warming. Every system that Americans depend on for survival during the summer months is operating outside its design envelope simultaneously. And the summer of 2026 will be the stress test that reveals whether those systems can hold or whether they fracture. The evidence from March, which was itself a record-breaking month, suggests that the fractures are already forming. The question is not whether the systems are under stress. The question is how far the stress can go before the lights go out, the water stops flowing, the food gets scarce, and the heat becomes lethal. And the Americans who are prepared for that scenario, who have water stored, who have shelf-stable food, who have a plan for cooling without electricity, who have their medications stockpiled, who have communicated with their neighbors about mutual aid during an emergency, will survive the summer of 2026 in a fundamentally different condition than the Americans who assumed the systems would hold because they always have before. They have never been tested like this before. And the test begins in 45 days,